Thank you, NATO. Thanks, Creative Time, for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak here. Part of the modalities of my invitation were to be a regional reporter covering the Middle East, and I will rise to that challenge in part. In my case, I lived and worked in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, and over the last 10 years actually mainly elsewhere. So the question of how I could possibly reflect that in a viable way is a little convoluted. So what I'll do is I'll present three projects, one of which is in Tehran, another in Berlin, and another in Taipei, three places where I've been working extensively over the last year or so. So another issue I wanted to mention is that my interest in the social investment of certain projects as a curator, and I've been invited as a curator, are particularly with respect to those projects which have an investment in issues pertaining to the art field itself, the labor conditions, the exploitation and self-exploitation, the politics of art education, infrastructural questions, and so on and so forth. And I think that sometimes it's a shame when it almost seems like the phenomenon of internships or artists' wages are seen as less, embodying less gravitas or being more symbolic endeavors than questions of democracy at large and city policy, etc. Second and final issue of framework, I did want to throw out that some of those projects which correspond to these criteria most faithfully and who have an astounding commitment to improving certain working premises in the field would actually not be very interested in being represented at the Creative Time Summit, and would actually be very annoyed with me if I did voice their agenda. And this is not only because they're grassroots or such, nor because there's some evil regime looking over their shoulder. They want to keep a low profile. Although that may play a role, it's also because the Midas touch of art world curiosity is very often a greater threat to certain projects than even the big bad regime looking over their shoulder. And I think that when we're talking about very ambitious issues such as a community resistant to power, I think that has to be raised, this question of which side of power are we on in certain situations, and how does that play into the politics of visibility. Okay, my first example. So Tang Huangchen, excuse my pronunciation, is an artist based in Taipei who couldn't really care less if I would talk about her here at the summit or not. And I came across her work as I was working on the Taipei Biennial. I was curating it with Hongjon Lin over the course of this year. And she's aside from her practice as an artist, she's interested in setting up an artists' union and to attain legal recognition, political recognition for artists as a professional category. And the project is unusual for several reasons. First of all, it spans wildly different practices and wildly different generations. And this is not always the case in these collective efforts. And the other point that I wanted to raise is that aside from lobbying in the standard strategic sense of the term, with the standard methods at their disposal, the group around Tang is trying to address underlying premises that have made the foundation of such unions so difficult all around the world. And these are premises that are quite old and which, involve the idea of the artist as a genius lone ranger who can, under no circumstances be embedded within a collective body such as a a union, and these working premises are, of course, by enlightened minds such as ours, scoffed at over beers and in certain seminars, but they're rarely revisited in a rigorous enough way so as to unleash a discussion which might lead to something like a union. And moreover, one might say that what is interesting in projects and comparable projects like Tang's is the fact that if artists helped bring about post-Fordist working conditions as we now know them, then maybe they could also be important in redefining what a union in such a context might represent. So that would be a contribution to a discussion which goes far beyond the arts. I'd like to already move on to. This is a questionnaire which Tang elaborated, and this is from her own practice, where she is revisiting these premises of how do artists consider themselves as a professional category, and what distinguishes them as such. What are the features that make their work more difficult to represent through a union, and so on and so forth. Okay, the second example is a Berlin example, the Workers' Punk Art School, which was spearheaded by the artist Tito Steyer, together with art students and artists in Berlin very recently. And Steyer is someone who is interested in not only the conditions of productions within the arts and other questions pertaining to those issues that I mentioned earlier, but also she's very invested in education, and more precisely in the micro-politics of the educational setting. What is at stake in a certain format, in a certain discursive format, and you can see this in the project that I want to present to you. I should point out the bottom right. It's mentioned that the Workers' Punk Art School is a temporary project, and it's also it appropriates its name in appreciation of the Workers' Punk University, Ljubljana. That's an interesting point because Europe was swamped with student protests over the year of 2009, and I was based in Berlin at the time, and pretty much every mainstream newspaper, left and right, accredited these, claimed that the cradle of these protests, which were mainly against the Bologna Accords, that the cradle of these protests was in Austria. And so it was with interest that I realized after seeing this, visiting this project, that actually Slovenia had been the locus of student protests, which were actually even more articulate and concerted than Austria's long before they reached Austria. And so this homage is, in a Berlin context, important for more reasons than one. I should also mention that these meetings, which are entirely self-run, and where Hito is little more than a master of ceremony, which often has guests from all manners of guests, and the atmosphere in these meetings is extremely, for lack of a better word, inspiring, empowering, a lot of other things. And I think that this has to do with the fact that it's not really trying to scream its critical agenda from the rooftops, nor is it documented in any way, which plays a huge role in these very fragile initiatives that I think we're talking about today, and which links back to these issues of visibility, which I mentioned in the beginning. Perhaps I should also throw in that Berlin is in dire need of art schools, decent art schools, and that lends this project another raison d'être. A last example. So we're moving from Taipei to Berlin to Tehran. And this is a project the Assad Art Gallery, which was founded by the artist Rosita Sharafjahan and her husband Mohsin Nabizadeh 10 years ago, maybe 11. And I could be taken to task for the question of in which case this is really a social practice. And I could point out that the team of the Assad Art Gallery take art amazingly seriously in all its political ramifications, and that they're open to all sorts of practices, from performance to video to themed group shows to educational initiatives, which did not have venues or many venues to choose from in Tehran. I could also mention that the gallery is open to all sorts of highly volatile, risky content, and I don't mean nudity, but questions of the cult of leadership or the murder of dissident intellectuals over the last years, and so on and so forth. And the gallery has been unflinching in the scope of work that it is willing to show. But an extra twist to this project is that it's a commercial enterprise. It's a commercial gallery. And a lot of the art that the gallery represents is far from, how to put it, conceptually ambitious or dematerialized. The gallery is very unapologetic about its commercial agenda, and I think that is actually also worth mentioning here. In terms of an artist such as Rosita creating her own support structure and then opening it up for examples such as those I just mentioned. And I thought I'm quite happy to talk about Assad here in New York. I think it's a good fit. The Assad team are eager for international contacts. I think they're getting kind of bored with what they're doing, and I think that in New York it has a certain interest and it embodies a more epic form of what social engagement might mean. So I was eager to show this today, and I'll close during the last 2 minutes that I have by talking about a project that was shown there by the artist Shahab Fotouhi. This was just before the crackdown of June last year, in highly mediatized. And it's a little complicated to explain, but basically Shahab took advantage of a loophole in the law which says that every artwork which is shown in a public institution has to first be okayed by the Ministry of Culture. But at the same time, you are not obliged to gain permission for any electoral campaign activity that you might harbor. So Assad Art Gallery hosted what the artist called campaign headquarters as artwork. He commissioned a designer called Farhad Fozuni to come up with a logo. This is the face of Mousavi, who is the opposition leader in Iran. Hung artworks by Mousavi and his wife. They were both practicing artists at a certain point in time in the gallery, and hosted a panel which lasted 3 hours and which represented various factions of the opposition, which he moderated himself as the artist. So this was a project which was packaged as an artwork, but was obviously much more than that, and at the same time. Thank you very much.